Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. And this is my first time doing a book review in a little while. I've done a good few movie reviews and a couple of play reviews, but it has been a minute since I've done a proper book review. But I wanted to talk about this book today for some very special reasons, and that book is Within Cessation by Noir. I believe this is Noir most recent book, and if you have not watched it yet, I recently put up a tiny highlight reel of my experience at Monster Bash in Mars, Pennsylvania, which is an awesome horror convention. I met some amazing people there and did some really fun things, and one of the booths there was Noir's. I got to meet her. She was really nice. She explained to me what all of the books she was selling were about, and I was really intrigued by the synopsis for this one, so I decided to pick it up. She ended up signing it for me, which was lovely, and I thought I would do a review because that was a really special event for me, really fun experience, and I ended up really enjoying the book, and I think other people should check it out. So the synopsis for this book, I'm just going to read off of the back. Tatum Hyland is a man obsessed with reinventing himself. Determined to cast off his reputation as a washed-up former romance novelist, he challenges himself to write something completely different, an apocalyptic survival story. But as the world around him spirals into chaos, Tatum must learn to differentiate between reality and fiction, and choose between his own survival and that of his work. So I did actually have to look up what cessation means, which is ending, and they do get into that eventually in the book, but I was just like, this is a really cool sounding title. I have no idea what it means. But now that I do know what it means, I think it fits the book really well, because this is both a story about a novelist descending into madness and an apocalypse story. And in those ways, I was like, oh, this reminds me of one of my favorite movies, which is In the Mouth of Madness. This is not the wild, wacky meta thing that In the Mouth of Madness is, but it does, to some degree, blur the lines between what's going on in what Tatum is writing and what is going on in the world. And what Tatum is writing is this zombie apocalypse novel, very standard in a lot of ways, although there are things that he's put in there to be like, this will differentiate me. But then what's going on in the world is kind of a zombie apocalypse thing, but in the sense that things like 28 Days Later or The Crazies or Rabid are zombie-esque. It's people getting infected with something. They think it's a virus, or it might just be like an epidemic of people who are suddenly deciding they want to go on a senseless killing spree, because there's like literally no motive behind their killing. There's just people suddenly being like, I'm going to kill you right now for no reason. And it's terrifying. So I'm going to kind of break this down into three categories, I guess, which are characters, plot, and writing style. I think the characters are really well done. They're not the most unique, kooky characters I've seen in anything, but I found myself being able to get a very clear sense of who they were. Tatum himself is not a likable protagonist. You grow to kind of sympathize with him because you're seeing everything from his perspective, but even then, you can tell that he's kind of a slob, he's kind of a pervert, and he's very, very self-absorbed in so many ways. And he's trying to not be any of those things, but he's not doing a great job of it. And the book seems to be very aware of those things and really playing off of them in a way that's really fun. Also fucking terrifying sometimes, but interesting and enjoyable for the most part. Don't always want to use the word enjoyable when it's like these absolutely mortifying scenes that actually really stressed me out, but it was really engaging. Tatum's the main person we're looking at, and besides him kind of being a little bit of a shithead, but one that you can still sympathize with, Noir describes him in terms of being a writer in ways that, as someone who is like, I'm published in my school's literary journal. It's one short story. You can actually listen to me read that on my channel. Shameless self-promotion. But as someone who is a writer and is currently trying to write a novel, I'm not like the former romance novelist that Tatum is in any way, but he has this constant like self-doubt about his writing. Again, he seems selfish a lot of times when he's just like constantly wanting validation from his publisher Jackie about his work and constantly getting shot down, and then going to his friend Ellie to hopefully get more validation about it, but also kind of wanting a critique. Of course, I want to hear people say they like my work, but I also do actually want to get valid criticisms from people. So when people are just like, it's great, I'm like, thanks. That doesn't help me at all. But what I think this does really well is both show that he really wants validation, but also that he does want criticism from people so that he can change things later, and that he's always trying to capture something that he is worried absolutely is not there in his writing, and that he had before, because he's both trying to be like, please don't pigeonhole me as the author of The Devil's Saga, which is like this romance novel series he did about the devil falling in love with a mortal woman. But at the same time, he's like, these were better times. I was actually well known and well respected then. People liked my writing. And that just idea of trying to capture something you had before, even if it's like not the genre you're doing or the style or the person you are now, but trying to capture just like the magic of writing or anything else that you did before, feels very relatable. Because right before I did this review, I was looking back through the typed manuscript for the book I'm trying to write right now, and even then, I'm just looking at some of the earlier stuff I wrote and was able to get like peer reviewed and get feedback on. And I'm just like, this stuff I'm really proud of. I really like this. Why can't the parts of the book that I'm writing right now be up to caliber with this earlier stuff? And I'm probably going to look back at this later portion of the book and be like, this is fine. What am I worrying about? But that constant like nagging self-doubt and worry that you're not as good at this as you used to be is very, very present in Tatum in a way that I thought was brilliant. But again, when I say he's a shithead, I do mean that, because he's constantly like sensed this sexual tension between him and his friend Ellie that I'm sure Ellie does not feel. I might be misremembering or just have concocted this in my mind, but I do very much get the sense for his character that he thinks that there's always some kind of sexual tension in male-female friendships, which, no. But she is able to write this great balancing act for his character where, yes, he's very neglectful of his shitty, grimy apartment that's overrun with ants and probably needs an exterminator. He's kind of a pervert. He senses sexual tension with his best friend that probably isn't there. He's very self-absorbed, and he has these delusions of grandeur and being able to reach and touch millions of people through his work, which, I mean, also kind of relatable, because, like, I don't want to have this kind of huge ego, and I don't want to be, like, a sellout writer and just, like, be famous. I feel like fame would absolutely crush me and be the most stressful thing ever in a lot of ways. But I do feel that being able to connect with large amounts of the right people and get that kind of validation that my work is inspiring the feelings that I want it to is very relatable. It's this act that feels very selfless because it's supposed to be benefiting other people, but it's also building up your ego at the same time. So it's kind of selfish, and that's written very well. And this overall sense of self-doubt and genuine moments of concern for his friends, particularly Ellie. All of that is very, very well written. Ellie herself, I really like. She doesn't get a ton of development, but you get the sense that she's also not a particularly neat person. She is a little bit more put together than Tatum is, and she's just like been his best friend for the longest time, and she has all of these habits that he finds kind of annoying but ultimately endearing. There's also a bunch of great tension between him and her that's not sexual per se, even though it probably is for Tatum because reasons. But she gets pregnant early on in the book, and Tatum's like, first does the most insensitive thing ever and gets sparked with an idea for his book and runs off right after she's told her this very vulnerable thing, and goes off and writes the first chapter of his book where he's writing this zombie apocalypse story about a mom who's been left to parent her child alone in this apocalypse because her then boyfriend got her pregnant and then ran off. And he realizes that he was insensitive, and he's trying to, dance around the sensitive topic or not step on anybody's toes by saying the wrong thing. And there are these moments of just unsettling things that happen out of character for both of them, because we're seeing stuff from Tatum's perspective, but then he'll do something that's very kind of off, and it's just like, why is he acting that way towards Ellie? And then Ellie will do the same thing. So I'm not going to spoil what happens later on, but there is this seeming virus going around that's just turning people into murderers with no rhyme or reason, and it very much casts suspicion and unease from the outset when those characters will do things that feel just a little bit off. And the one other major player in this book, because it's like a worldwide apocalypse, leastways as far as we can tell, because it's definitely covered the entire US, but there's no way to really communicate with the rest of the world to know. But it is this very grand scale apocalypse story, but the main players in this thing are just Tatum, Ellie, and Jackie. And Jackie is this character who you get the sense is a good person, but because she is Tatum's editor, she's a little bit hard on him, and he is unnecessarily hard on her in his thoughts. She's probably the least developed of the three characters, but I get the sense that she really gets on Tatum's nerves, but that if we were seeing this from anyone else's perspective, we would like her a lot more. Story-wise, this has some of the scariest sequences I've seen in anything in a very long time. I'm not going to spoil what happens later on, but things will just be happening in Tatum's life. He'll just be trying to work on his book, meeting with his friends, and then something absolutely horrifying will just erupt nearby him. This happens at his neighbor's house at the beginning of the book, but highlight of the book for me is when he and Ellie are driving in the car together and they get stopped in traffic because there's a woman who has gotten out of her car in front of them and is stabbing the shit out of anyone nearby. And it just feels like this real jarring event where, rather than being described in these very dramatic, detailed terms, there is detail to it, but it feels like you're watching it from a distance and you have no idea what the hell's going on, and it's scary. Really, really scary. It feels like what would be happening if you were just going about your day and someone pulled out a weapon and started going at people. It feels very visceral and is very upsetting, but in a good way. I also find it kind of darkly humorous just how dedicated to his writing Tatum is, because no matter what kind of carnage is happening around him and no matter how much the world is crashing down, he will find a way to sit down and type up more of his manuscript, and as society itself is falling apart, he's still trying to find a way to publish his book. I get the sense of obviously not being able to take no for an answer and just desperately wanting to put something else out into the world. But when literally the population is killing itself and society has fallen apart and there is nowhere to publish your book, the fact that he's still trying is funny in this really dark way to me that I like. And the actual apocalyptic stuff in this as I said earlier, it captures this very visceral, real feeling fear. And for me, it does that in a way that encompasses a lot of very current fears. Like, I have no doubt that this is drawing on the anxieties of the COVID pandemic, because there's a lot of discussion of, will they develop a vaccine for this? Which, I mean, they have by now, but earlier on, there was a lot of anxiety about that. Tatum's always talking about when things go back to normal, even though he kind of knows in the back of his head that nothing is ever really going to go back to normal. And that felt very topical. And again, at the same time, it's drawing on that absolute anxiety of being in the presence of some kind of unexpected real world violence. And then manages to combine both of those things in a way that feels reminiscent of both the zombie novel that Tatum is writing and a lot of like apocalypse media in general, where it's just like, oh my gosh, killing virus, everyone's killing each other. And it does reach this over the top level that feels set apart from reality just enough for me to be comfortable with reading it, but realistic enough for it to make me the right degree of uncomfortable. I do have just like a couple of gripes with the plot, mostly regarding the ending, because based on a lot of like things that were happening contextually throughout this book, I really got the sense that these elements were building to a very specific payoff, which never really happened in any way whatsoever. And I would tell you exactly what that is, but that would spoil it for you that that's not what happens. There's a lot of like contextual things earlier that I'm like, if this gets paid off later in the book, I'm going to be really happy. And it doesn't really get paid off. Like, there's little moments where you're just like, I wonder if this person's infected, and then the person turns out to be infected, and you're like, aha, there was this moment of doubt earlier, and then you were like, everything's fine, and then it's not. So there's like that constant suspicion and little things that you could miss that do get paid off, but the actual ending of the book, I felt was going to be paying off things that happened earlier, but it doesn't. It feels very sudden to me and also very open-ended. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's fitting for this book, because it is very much a book about not being able to accept that something is coming to an end and a very sudden, headlong throwing something into the apocalypse. So the fact that the ending does just kind of happen, and the fact that it does feel less like the punchline of this humorless, horrifying joke that was set up earlier, and more just like this sudden screaming into the void, it feels fitting thematically. It just wasn't satisfying to me narratively. But maybe that unsatisfyingness actually does help the book's point in some ways. That does not change the fact that it was unsatisfying for me, though. And then, stylistically, I think this book is beautifully written. It's not particularly fancy, but Tatum is not a particularly fancy person, so he thinks in fairly simple terms. But there are these just beautiful kind of poetic moments of prose that he'll be thinking in his head. And they're very thoughtful and kind of poignant, but you also get the sense that when he's saying these things, he's kind of absorbed in himself, and that works really well. The other thing that this does that I thought was really cool is whenever Tatum sits down to write his own book, which will happen like no matter what's happening, it's not quite on the like absurd levels of Nicolas Cage's character in Willy's Wonderland, who's just like, oh, break time, while he's in the middle of, a fight. But it has that same energy of him just being like, oh, well, guess the world's falling apart around me, time to write. And he'll always find some kind of contrived excuse to do that. But when he does actually sit down to write, interspersed with the chapters of this book are the chapters of the book that he's writing. So you also get to see his zombie story play out. And the characters in that are Chelsea and Spencer and Jillian. And I'm not going to go into all of them because that's not the main plot of this book. but I was also very engaged in their own little zombie story, which is a little bit more melodramatic than the stuff that's happening in the real world, but that is very fitting, and I do find it kind of funny just how often Chelsea will start thinking back on all the different things her daughter Jillian could have done, because yes, it's a poignant thought, but it happens so many times that I find it kind of funny. And I'm sorry, Noir, if that's a knock on your writing, but mostly I just get the sense that that is something that Tatum is like, oh, this is really good. I gotta keep doing this throughout the book. So it felt like a good fit for his character in a way that I thought was fun. Overall, the ending wasn't the most satisfying for me, but that might thematically work for some people. I mean, there's like a few typos and stuff that I spotted, but literally any book can have those. So this is a really, really strong book. It has managed to unsettle me and stress me out in a way that a horror book has not done for me in a while. I was engaged with the characters, I was engaged with the story, and the story within the story and the ideas it was presenting. It's just a really good book, and you should definitely check it out. I will link Noir's social media stuff in the description, as well as hopefully a link where you can buy her book. I will also be linking her YouTube channel up here in the cards because she has a YouTube channel that's pretty good. That is my review of Within Cessation. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!